Victorian Senator James Paterson is one of the co-sponsors of the bill, and he joins us from our Parliament House studio. James, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Patricia.
Well, I think you just heard Christopher Pyne probably there, and of course he's the pretty senior minister in your government. He says, nobody is stopping me at the supermarket to say, you really need to reform 18C. Is he right?
Oh, I think that's probably fair. It's certainly not a top-of-mind issue for most members of the public, but that doesn't mean it's not an important issue, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's an issue that is never raised with members of Parliament. I've got hundreds and hundreds of emails from constituents who've asked me to raise this issue, who are concerned about this issue, because it goes to the core tenet of living in a free society, and that is our ability to freely express ourselves, which I think is pretty fundamental, and I'd like to think that all parliamentarians would like to stand up for.
James, I know this is a very important issue for you, and you've made no bones about this, you've been very clear about it, but is it more important than backing your Prime Minister and the policy he took to the election? Because this is open defiance of the policy of your party on the first day of the Parliament.
Well, Patricia, I have to say I don't share your interpretation of what we took to the election. The government from 2014 said that it had no plans to make any changes to Section 18C. That does not preclude any member of the government, particularly a backbencher, from proposing that we should have plans to address it and from putting that forward to public debate, in this case through a private senator's bill, and allowing the public and members of Parliament to make up their mind about whether we should proceed with that. So I don't think we are defying an election promise. I don't think we're defying our Prime Minister. This is a position, as you would know, that he himself has expressed his support for and said that he's comfortable with in the past.
The amendment would seek to remove the words offend and insult from the legislation. Would you replace them? Would they just be gone? What would happen?
The amendment only proposes to remove those two words and do nothing else. It's actually significantly more moderate than a previous version of a bill to amend 18C was, that was put forward by the Abbott government under the Attorney-General George Brandis, which would have gone much further. This is what's regarded by many people who watch this issue closely as a compromise measure. It's supported by people who are generally associated with the left of politics, like David Marr and Julian Burnside and others. So I think it's a very modest measure to attempt to restore freedom of speech.
Section 18D of the Racial Discrimination Act contains exemptions which protect freedom of speech. These ensure that artistic works, scientific debate and fair comment on matters of public interest are exempt from Section 18C. So, and I think part of that is that it has to be done reasonably and in good faith. So there is already a protection built in, isn't there?
Well, it was certainly intended to do that, but I think the evidence shows that it has failed to do that in reality, and the Andrew Bolt case in 2011 is a very good example of that. You may be aware that he was found not to be eligible to use the defence in 18D, and he was found to not be eligible for that for two reasons. The first is that the judge in the case found that he made factual errors.
That's right.
And the second reason is that the judge thought that the tone in which he engaged in his journalism, particularly the use of sarcasm and gratuitous asides, meant that he was not engaging in good faith. Now, I think that second aspect of that finding is particularly worrying. I don't think it's a good thing to live in a society where judges can decide that journalists' tone and use of sarcasm mean they are not entitled to freedom of speech.
So I know that Labor and the Greens and I think the Nick Xenophon team don't support this. So you can't actually get it through, even though there's so many of you. I've watched politics for many years in this country. 13 government senators backing this bill, I think, is an extraordinary number. But still, you can't get it through, can you?
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic than that, Patricia. I've watched Senator Xenophon's comments very closely in particular, and while he's certainly said that he doesn't think that this is a priority, he's also recognised that there are good arguments for change, and he's also said that he's open to a Senate inquiry to look into this issue. So I think that's a good pathway forward for all of us to take, and I'm optimistic that through this process, and particularly due to an upcoming case which I expect we'll have the findings of very shortly at the Queensland University of Technology, that we'll have an opportunity to persuade our colleagues that this does need to be addressed, and I hope that we'll be successful.
James, there's also expected to be a private member's bill moved in the lower house to legalise same-sex marriage, and I think there's another alternative one as well. What's your response to this? Because you've openly defied what the Prime Minister's been saying on this issue of the Racial Discrimination Act. Do you also think that people should be allowed to cross the floor to do what they want on this bill on same-sex marriage?
Well, one of the reasons why I'm very proud to be a Liberal Party senator, Patricia, is that we very jealously guard the freedom of conscience of the backbench. So if you're a backbench Liberal member or senator, it is of course your right to speak out as you wish, and if you feel necessary to cross the floor on an issue. Now, that is not a luxury that applies to the government ministers, and that's obvious why that's not the case. But anyone who feels sufficiently strongly about that always has the option of returning to the backbench to take that up. On the plebiscite, I don't expect that any of my colleagues will take that up, but of course they are entitled to.
Why not? Why don't you expect them to take it up?
Because I think there's overwhelming support for the Prime Minister's position and for the position that we took to the election that there should be a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. There's a view that this is the best path forward to legalising same-sex marriage, and certainly a view that's been expressed by my colleagues who are very enthusiastic about same-sex marriage, like Tim Wilson.
My understanding is that that Cory Bernardi's on his way to the UN. Are you going to then become kind of the leader of the 18C racial discrimination repeal, reform movement on the government side once Cory Bernardi's out of the country?
Well, I'm not expecting that this will be addressed in the short term. As the Prime Minister has said, we do have other more time-sensitive priorities and they'll be dealt with first. But my hope is sometime throughout this term it will be dealt with. And if it does go to a Senate inquiry, that's a process that will take months. So I don't expect that this will be debated in the chamber before the end of the year. All that Senator Bernardi will do tomorrow is introduce the bill, and that basically just puts it on the agenda to be dealt with at some point in this term.
I saw it pointed out by a couple of people today that all of the MPs that are backing this bill to repeal or to reform, rather, 18C, are all white. And mostly men, but all white. Is that significant?
Well, Patricia, I don't think that someone's gender or their sexuality or their race or any other characteristic that is that defines them is a really relevant consideration on their policy.
Well, why do you think people from multicultural backgrounds, from ethnically diverse backgrounds, don't seem to back this?
Oh, I can tell you, Patricia, I know many people from those backgrounds who do absolutely back this, who I know personally, who have written to me, who I've spoken with about this. There is a diverse range of opinions in the multicultural community, in many communities.
There's diverse community views in every community, absolutely.
Exactly.
No one speaks in a homogenous voice, and it would be silly to argue that. But Tony Abbott did cite the concerns of ethnic communities as his reason for shelving the previous push to change 18C. So at a leadership level, the majority view appears to be from a diverse mix of Australians from a diversity of backgrounds that are not Anglo-Saxon, that this is not right.
Well, I hope that through this process, through a Senate inquiry and through this new bill, which is different from the previous bill, that we can reassure them that this will ensure that they remain protected against hate speech, but also allow at the same time all Australians to participate freely in public debate and have the cherished human right of freedom of expression. I don't think it's too hard to achieve both of those things. Personally, I think that removing offend and insult is one good way of addressing it, but I'm open-minded. I'm open to hearing people's suggestions as to other ways that we can address this. What I don't believe is that the status quo can persist any longer, because it is been proven to be limiting people's freedom of speech, and I don't even think provides sufficient or necessary protections for people against abuse.
Well, many thanks for joining us, James. It'll be very interesting to watch. A pretty, colourful first day of the Parliament, you've got to admit that.
It sure was. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you. And that's Victorian Senator James.